Let's play a little matching game. I always remember those were great fun at school. I'm going to name a country or region of the world, and you'll tell me who was the primary colonial power over that place. We good? All right, let's start with some easy things. Mexico.
Spain.
Very good. Massachusetts. England. All right, very good. Let's make a little bit harder here. Vietnam. France. All right. So, what's that? Well, World War II colonialism was very short-lived, so that's why I specifically said primary, the primary colonial power. Many of these places changed hands over many centuries. For example, if we wanted to talk about the first primary colonizer of Indonesia, we would need to say Holland. Holland. This was the Dutch East Indies, out there. What about Australia?
British.
What about India?
British.
Spain and then England.
Spain did have outposts, but it never actually colonized India. What about Afghanistan? England again. What about Pakistan? Bangladesh? All right, England, it's England all the way down. We got a lot of those. Let's go to someplace else. How about Brazil? Portugal. Oh, look at you all paying attention in your history class. Excellent. Let's try something a little bit in another part of the world. What about Algeria? France. Okay, not bad. Egypt? England again. I know. Sorry, England is all over the place. What about Lebanon? France. Syria? Iraq? Iran? Britain again. What about Kuwait? UAE, Qatar? It's all England all throughout that area as well. Now, you might have gotten a little confused on some of those because we were never clear in defining what a colony is. And this is a point of great confusion in the modern conversation, because the word colony can mean two different things. It can mean a political thing, and it can mean more of a political economic thing. So let's start with a simple political definition. What is a colony, just in a straight political definition? Oh dear, now no one wants to. The matching game was, see, that's the thing. The multiple choice questions on the exam, always much easier than the open response, right? So politically, a colony is a territory that is being controlled by a foreign power, by somebody that is not indigenous to that area. So if we ever make a colony on the moon, right, there's no indigenous population on the moon, but it would definitely be controlled by a foreign power because there's also no native government on the moon. And so it would be a moon colony. That's why we can use the word for we need to have space colonies. And it's a purely political term. Sovereignty will be held by something not local to that area. On the other hand, if that colony on the moon decided they didn't want to be a colony anymore and they became independent, well, then there would be an independent moon outpost or a moon country or nation or whatever we want to call it. It would no longer be called a colony. The same way that when the United States broke away from the UK, we no longer get called a colony of the UK. We are now an independent nation. And likewise, all the other countries on the list that became independent. Their sovereignty is no longer at the control of a foreign power. Now, you mentioned a particular aspect of that I want to say is a subcategory. Not all colonies involve having people move there from the home country. This is the two different versions of colonies that happen politically. There is a colony that involves, indeed, the settling of that area. So, for example, Australia, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, these were places where large numbers of people from the sovereign country, the home country, were sending people there in order to stay there. Not to merely administrate, not to act as soldiers, not just for business purposes, but to actually set down roots and develop towns, communities, etc., regardless of what the indigenous people would have wanted. We'll come back to that in a minute. But that is one version of colonialism, to actually settle an area with people from the home country. Everyone with me so far? Okay, if you're wondering why we're doing political science, we'll get there. Version 2 is more heavily focused on resource extraction. Now, version 1 can be as well. That is to say, the home country, for example, England, may want to set up a colony, for example, 13 of them in what we now call the United States, to both settle them with people, but to also extract resources from this place, whether it be timber, beaver pelts, or in the Caribbean, things like sugarcane, or whether it be cotton. And those would then be shipped back to the home country to be used in their industrialization and their profit making, so that the colony would be both a source of resources and also a captive market to then offload the finished products and sell them there. Hold on, it's okay, we're getting there. But then there is colonial version 2, which is only about the extraction. For example, India was primarily an extractive colony. There were not huge numbers of British people moving to India in order to set down their roots, build up communities, and live in India forever. They were there to administer what was going on in that country for the benefit of, well, the East India Company, and to make the British people wealthier, at least in theory. And there was no attempt to actually settle that land, only to extract value from it. Everyone's with me so far, okay? All right, because it is that latter version of colony that is the economic version of colony. And that is a version that is made popular through Marxist teachings and made popular through a lot of economic theory, which is that why do countries have colonies in the first place? Right? Well, one answer would be, oh, we need more room. Well, that's sort of an expansionist idea, a Roman Empire. We're just going to continue to roll out the borders and we'll set up new places and those will become colonies. But usually we don't call those colonies when it is merely imperial expansion of your people, because you're just increasing the borders. The people out there eventually become some kind of citizen, and it is not done purely for the benefit of home. Colonialism in a pure economic term is usually defined as being purely for the benefit of the home. In fact, this is why America broke away, because we didn't like being a piggy bank for England. We didn't like taxation without representation. We wanted to be able to have some say in how we were governed for our own benefit, not tilting the scales only for the benefit of the home country, for the United Kingdom. And this then gets us into our modern confusion. Back to our matching game. Israel. Who colonized? Was it? Right, so again, there is a difference between migratory expansion and actual colonization for the benefit of a home country. Right, when Persia conquered, they didn't consider it to be a colony of Persia. They just considered it to be a new province of Persia, the same way that California is not a colony of Washington, D.C., it's a new state. And as such, it has responsibilities and obligations and is believed to make the country better by its inclusion. And so too, when the Romans rolled over Judea, when the Persians rolled over, when the Babylonians, when the Assyrians, when the Egyptians, all the different empires throughout history have gone through Israel, none of them were thinking we are going to extract the value here, or we're going to deliberately settle it with our people in order to maximize value extraction. They just said, look, more people, more territory, more good. We take over, we have a bigger border, now we can get more taxes, now we can have a bigger army, and fight more wars to do exactly the same over and over again, until Archimedes finally points out the problem with that geometrical issue. Israel was never officially colonized throughout its history. It was often conquered, but it wasn't colonized. And yet, at the foundation of many of the complaints about Israel in the modern world is that it is a settler colonial project. that it is a settler colonial project. Those magic words erase the legitimacy of Israel in its totality in the eyes of people who believe that that's what it is. If Israel is a settler colonial project, then by definition, it is extractive, it is exploitative, and thus illegitimate. The same way that if somebody was to establish a colony, if the United States sent their armies into country Q, and they decided to set up shop there and force the people of country Q to work for the benefit of the United States, most of us would consider that to be a rather illegitimate enterprise going on. Even if we gave country Q its own flag and their own national anthem, if we were still in charge of country Q and still extracting value from it, most of us would say that feels a little sketchy. Maybe that's not legitimate for us to build something like that. We're following the pattern here. We're seeing why people who believe this as being a settler project, settler colonial project, would consider it illegitimate. If you need to understand people who argue against us in order to understand where the flaws reside and then how best to respond. But we haven't even gotten to the main flaw. Because remember our matching game. We have country A colonized by country B. Country C colonized by country B. It was Britain almost all the time, but by lots of other places. Israel, we just established, was never a colony. Because for it to be a colony, you would need there to be a home country. You need to have a home country for it to be a colony. That's what a colony is. Who's the home country of Israel for the people who argue that it is a settler colonial project? Israel itself. Actually not. So we got to go a little bit historical here because there were two stages. There was a stage where someone did make a concerted effort to identify a home country for Israel very, very passionately and unfortunately persuasive at the time. In the middle of the Cold War, 60s, 70s, and so on, Israel was becoming more and more clearly aligned with Western Europe. And if something was aligned with Western Europe and the United States, then who would be unhappy about that during the Cold War? The Soviet Union. I know the Cold War was a long time ago, people, but you got to remember this stuff because it still matters today. So the Soviet Union put together an entire think tank, an entire literature department propaganda wing, in order to paint Israel as a settler colonial project of Europe and the United States. And they could point to all the other examples, Egypt, Algeria, Lebanon, Syria, that had gone through colonialization by Europe, as Israel was being one more example of that. And if you didn't like what the French did in Algeria, if you didn't like what they did in Egypt, if you didn't like et cetera, then you shouldn't like Israel either. And if you think being buddy-buddy with the West is a good idea, says the Soviet Union, well, look what they're doing. They're still colonizing the world. So if you are in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, this could be quite persuasive. You know what it was like to be colonized by these Western European countries, and you didn't like it, so you should agree that what Israel is doing is wrong because Israel is just an outpost of the West. They are a colony of the West. All right, Soviet Union's no longer around. And even at the time, most people were able to point out, Europe is not actually using Israel like a colony. Europe wasn't getting rich off of what Israel was doing. Europe wasn't even getting military support, like the Falklands, by having this as an outpost. Europe, in fact, was generally not benefiting by the existence of Israel by most metrics. So calling it a colony of Europe or the United States really doesn't work. So fast forward to 2026, the Cold War is long gone. No one is really advocating that Israel is just a European outpost, and yet they still call it a colony. Well, a colony of who? Who is the mother country? Well, I'll give you a hint. Look in a mirror. You are the mother country, the international Jew. You see, there is a strong belief in the rest of the world, also propagated by Russian propaganda, this time by the Tsar, back in the early 20th century, that there is an international Jewish cabal, that we are secretly coordinating all of the efforts of Jews around the world for our own nefarious purpose, our own extractive purpose, and that Israel is an expression of that international Jewish coordination. Now, on the one hand, anybody here ever support JNF? Anybody ever support Karen Kayemet? Anyone ever support Friends of the IDF? Magen David Adom? All of the different programs that most of us either grew up or continue to support that help make life in Israel a little better. Well, doesn't that mean we're part of the international secret Jewish organization? Well, no. No, not so. Well, first of all, it's not so secret. And second of all, the idea that Israel is a colony as an outpost of international Jewry is built on. The foundation stone is the anti-Semitic idea that all Jews around the world work together to harm all non-Jews around the world. That we are all secretly benefiting from this colony. That we are controlling the world through this colony. And you'll see this in just recent months with the war in Iran, with people arguing that Israel is controlling the United States. That Netanyahu is controlling the president of the US, making him do his bidding. Because he is, after all, a puppet master. And he's a puppet master because he can coordinate the power of Jewish groups around the world, such as Epstein, he was Jewish, right? And the international bankers like the Rothschilds, and all of them work together to force the US to do whatever Israel wants, and Israel does whatever the international Jew wants. This is how it ends up back in our laps. Because the people that attack Israel as a colony are attacking us as Jews. Because there is no way to call Israel a colony when you've actually looked at the situation, unless you are willing to believe that there is a secret mother organization that is in charge of this, that is making it happen. Now, there are good reasons to criticize Israel. I gave you a whole bunch of them last week, and that video is up on YouTube now. But this ain't one of them. Because the idea of criticizing Israel as a colonial enterprise is fallacious and anti-Semitic. And it is also predicated on abrogating the identity of Jews as indigenous to the land of Israel. We are indigenous to the land of Israel. This has been proved genetically. It is obviously proved historically, archaeologically, as well as with our own texts and our culture. We are indigenous to there. Doesn't mean we can't live in Orlando. We do. But the land that we came from and that many of our brothers and sisters now live in are the same land. We are indigenous to that land. And when people argue against colonization, the primary explanation of why colonization is wrong is because it thwarts the rights of the indigenous population. Colonization is wrong because it deprives the local population, the indigenous population, the non-foreign power population, from expressing themselves in freedom to their fullest extent and to their own unique culture. And that is exactly why Israel was created, so that there would be a place where Jews could live securely and fully express themselves to whichever extent of their culture they would like, without fear of reprisal and destruction from any other country in which they were currently living, without worrying that the capital city might pass a law that makes our religion untenable or difficult. Right now, there's a huge argument in Belgium, for example, regarding having circumcision. And they are making it harder and harder for people to be circumcised. That's not going to happen in Israel, because Israel is governed according to the indigenous culture of Judaism, in which circumcision for boys is part of our culture. By denying the indigeneity of Jews, we are simultaneously saying that we have no business being in Israel and we have no business being anywhere else. By saying that Israel is a colonial project, you are saying the Jews don't belong there. They have never come from there. But at the same time, you are also saying the Jews around the world are coordinating, cooperating, and secretly making this happen for their own benefit. And yet we know that around the world, Jews do not feel indigenous to any other country. We may feel at home. Thank God we have been well treated in the last few decades in the United States. But that doesn't mean that we have an indigenous claim to this place. So we become homeless on two fronts. We are homeless because we're not allowed in Israel. We're homeless because we're not indigenous to anywhere else. And yet, they will argue that there is no anti-Semitism built into this criticism. If we go back, the reason why the settler colonial arguments gained such traction is because of Russian propaganda at the beginning and middle of the 20th century. It is perpetuated because it has become a touchstone of argument about the rights of indigenous populations, which continues to be built upon the idea created by those Russian propagandists that in fact the Jews have no home, and therefore we have no rights. If we wish to discuss the difficulties in Israel and the need for peace between Jews and non-Jews, between Israelis and Palestinians, between those who live in Israel and those who live in countries across the border, there is much to discuss. There is much to consider and understand how we can find a peaceful resolution for the majority of those that are in that territory. But if we begin with the premise that the Jew is not indigenous and that they are in fact a colonizer of a secret organization, then there can be no hope. There can be no peace. There won't be progress. So if you hear somebody take this line, Israel is a colonial project, just ask them, whose? Whose colonial project is it? Why do we have no rights in our own country, in our own land? Why must we be pawns of some international cabal? Lord knows we are not claimed by the Germans or the French or the Dutch or the Belgians. We are not claimed by the Russians. If no one would claim us as being theirs, then how can we be their colony? If not there, then where? And don't give me some twaddle that it doesn't matter. You shouldn't be here because it infringes upon the rights of those that are. Because after 100 years, we are there too. And we must start with that fact. There are millions of Jews, there are millions of non-Jews. And if we argue about who is most illegitimate, we will never create peace. Shabbat Shalom.